A very good morning, everyone. We are present here for the debut seminar of the Art of Argumentation, How to Master Debating. And on this note, I would like to call Dr. Devashish Ray, our principal, to felicitate the guest. Sir, can you please come? Now, we have seen some of the other version of debating, but what we have not seen is the amount of exception debaters this country have created. And today we have with us one of the best debaters in India. And without further ado, I would like to introduce him. Today we have with us is Mr. PriyamMarik, who is a graduate of St. Xavier's College, Kolkata. He completed his schooling from St. Xavier's as well. Now, Priyam has been an active debater since his school days. He has been the Bosco polemic debate, the Mahadevi Birla World Academy debate, and the debattle challenge of none other than St. Xavier's College itself. Now, Priyam has won a humble number of 13 debates while his college time.
Very good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Talha, for organizing this and the entire iLEAD team for having me here. I was here at iLEAD sometime last year in 2018 for the Jefferson debate, and I was representing St. Xavier's College on that occasion. And it was great visiting here because everything is so seamlessly organized and there's always a packed audience. So today's session is, I won't like to call it a seminar per se, it's more like a conversation. It's more like a discussion on why argumentation matters. I'm going to talk to you about organized debating as well as semi-formal to informal debating. And I think the best thing about debating is that we all debate all the time. Sometimes we don't realize it. And we'll get to that as the seminar unfolds. What essentially is an argument before I get to how to argue and the art of argumentation? An argument is essentially a plea or a statement that is backed by reason. That is the difference between arguing and quarreling. When we quarrel, we don't necessarily have a reason. Like, for example, if your friend comes in late and maybe you're upset with him and you're like, "Tune kya kiya," right? And then both of you start jabbering and start fighting over how maybe you had scene zoned him last night or whatever it is, right? That essentially leads into a quarrel. But the moment you start introducing a reason, and if you tell your friend that, "Look, you were supposed to be here at 11 because we had a meeting at 11:15 and it's now 11:30. You are attributing a cause to your emotion. And attribution of that cause is essentially an argument. So why do we need to argue, right? Of course, if you look at formal argumentation, if you look at debates, if you look at competitions that require you to argue, then that's a necessary skill. But even in real life, it's very handy to know how to argue. And why is that? Because, as I said earlier, most of the time that is essentially what we are doing without realizing. How so, right? So the moment you go ahead and bargain for a dress in a shop, you are arguing because you are engaging with the shopkeeper, telling him that there's a certain price this dress warrants and there's a certain price that you are willing to pay. And the shopkeeper on his side also has a certain profit margin which he needs to keep in mind. So whenever you're arriving at a negotiation, you are doing so by logic. Now, this logic may not always be rocket science. It need not always be something very fancy, something very academic, something that is based on, earth-shattering notions. It can be very simple as something like, "I want it, only have so much, I'm only going to pay you so much." That is also argumentation, guys, right? The moment you go ahead and maybe tell your parents, and I'm sure, somewhere down the line at some point in time in our lives, perhaps when we were younger, we've had to tell our parents that, "Please let us go for this party," or "Please let us go for this meeting. We'll come back within the specified amount of time," right? That is also a form of argumentation, but that has a very different tone. The way you would argue with a shopkeeper to buy a dress and reduce the price by, let's say, 100 rupees is not the same tone in which you would argue with your parent when you're trying to negotiate a certain time barrier or curfew limit when it comes to entering home, right? Argumentation also works in very emotionally strong aspects. For example, you're dating somebody and they want to break up. And you're giving them 3 reasons why you shouldn't break up with them or they shouldn't break up with you. Those reasons are not always as structured as a debate speech. If you tell your partner that, "Look, this is reason 1, so you should not break up with me. This is reason 2, you should not break up with me," they will break up with you, right? So you don't want that level of, let's say, seriousness in those sort of argumentations. But at the end of the day, it's still giving a logic. And I don't know if this will resonate with all of you, but as a debater, once you start getting into the whole thinking process of debating, your mind is arguing all the time, right? It is coming up with reasons for you to do something and also reasons for you not to do something. So argumentation is mundane. Argumentation is something that happens every day. It is something that is an inherent part of our lives, and therefore it is important. Now, how do we link argumentation to public speaking? Because debating is essentially a form of public speaking, right? Argumentation can also happen in isolated corners. It can happen in your own head. When, for example, you're trying to take a career decision. I'm sure all of you who joined iLEAD at some point in time made the call that, look, this is exactly where I'm headed to. And maybe you had other options which you rejected in favor of this institution. So that is a conflict that goes on in your head, right? That is an argument you have in your own head. But when you're speaking in public, there are few factors which you need to consider. First, and I think this was there in the poster that was made, is manner. Second is matter. And third is method. Now, these three are the 3 M's, as it were, of public speaking, around which your entire experience of being a public speaker revolves. Now, public speaking, of course, isn't only limited to debating. It can be delivering a talk, it can be reciting something, it can be going ahead and speaking on a particular topic and not taking a stance. Debating involves you taking a stance. That's the primary difference between debating and other forms of public speaking, right? So how do you weave in argumentation to public speaking and produce debating? In order to do that, you need something which is called structure. And I'll get to that. I'll explain all of that. Now, it might so happen that you might not find all of this interesting because this depends on a debater's proclivity. If you actually are inclined to go ahead into organized public speaking, you may find what I'm speaking interesting. But if you don't, I think it's still very important, right? Why? Because given the way the world works today, it is very important to stand out. And one of the ways you can stand out is actually by presenting yourself with that level of conviction. How many of you have heard of Robert Oppenheimer? Nobody. Okay. So Oppenheimer was the man who took charge of producing the atom bomb, right? You have heard of the atom bomb, right? Yeah. So when the atom bomb was being designed, the Americans were looking for somebody who could head the whole process. They had contacted lots of scientists, lots of nuclear scientists in particular, but none of them seemed to fit the deal. Now, Oppenheimer had never entered a laboratory in his life. He was educated in science, he had a very good background, but he was more of an academician. He had no practical knowledge of how to design even, let's say, a grenade, a hand grenade, let alone a nuclear bomb or an atom bomb. But Oppenheimer sensed that it was a great opportunity. So when he met with the head of the American security forces, he convinced the individual that he's the right guy, he's cut out for the job in a space of 5 minutes. And he did that through his ability to convince people. That was also a form of public speaking. Even if your audience is just one person, it's still public speaking. The moment you start addressing someone that is not you, it's a form of public speaking. You don't need an audience or a gallery of 50, 60 people, right? It can just be 1 or 2 people. So in those 5 minutes, Oppenheimer's scientific knowledge wasn't important. In those 5 minutes, Oppenheimer's CV wasn't important. In those 5 minutes, what was important was how convincing he was. How he could penetrate the mind of the person sitting in front of him and tell him that, look, I really want to do this. And I am different. I'm not like the others because I can sense the magnitude of this operation. I understand what designing an atom bomb really means. So these are the moments where, of course, not all of us will have the opportunity to, stand out in history like Oppenheimer did for the right reasons or the wrong reasons. But in our own ways, we all need to stand out. And before I really move into the technicalities of debating, I'll try to like to talk about why debating matters so much today, or at least the art of convincing people matters so much today. So we live in something which I like to call a capitalist warp, right? What is a capitalist warp? A capitalist warp is a system which destroys your dreams by fulfilling your ambitions, right? What do I mean by that? It might sound like an oxymoron. Like, how can you destroy somebody's dreams by fulfilling their ambitions? That's because our ambitions today are manufactured, right? The fact that at 20 we should be studying at this institution, the fact that at 25 we should have a job with a certain salary cap, the fact that at 30 we should be settled down with a beautiful partner who perhaps has just as much of a salary, but humse zyada nahi, for the egoists out there. So that sort of thing where time dictates what you're supposed to do in your life is a very capitalist concept. It is a concept that has come from the days of the Industrial Revolution and in the age of the digital world has morphed itself into something that we just simply cannot resist, right? So in this era where we need to fulfill certain ambitions, and we need to, no matter how idealistic we are and how much we like to say that, मुझे तो कोई फिक्र नहीं है, I'll just do my stuff, you'll end up having to ascribe to the social narrative, because after a point in time, not all of us can be a pariah, not all of us can just go out there and live our own life and get lucky and still make a big deal out of it, right? So how do you stand out in a system where everybody has similar skill sets and similar ambitions? You stand out by presenting yourself, you stand out by creating a story about yourself that is different. Now, by that, I don't mean you start deceiving people. I mean you start presenting yourself as somebody who is unique, who has something else that the other person does not in this ultra competitive world. One of the great ways to do that is actually to speak convincingly. Now, to speak convincingly, a misconception that persists among people is that I need to be really eloquent. I need to use flowery words. You don't. It helps to be eloquent. It helps if you can speak English like Shashi Tharoor, right? But at the same time, you can be very simple in your language. You can have a restricted vocabulary, but you can play into the emotions of whoever is sitting opposite to you. So thereby the language you use, the kind of words you use, your body language, and I'll get to body language in a separate discussion later on, all of these play a very, very important role in convincing people, right? That is where you essentially stand out. Most of the interviews that you'll be attending, once you start getting into the recruitment phase, once you start entering the job space, you will be given situations to analyze. You're all familiar with the concept of a GD, right? A group discussion. How do you stand out in a group discussion when everybody is like talking, right? You stand out by maybe speaking less, but speaking sense, by actually understanding where this discussion is going. All these are skills that debaters have to imbibe. Now, of course, you don't need to be a debater to be a successful speaker, but having a similar set of skill sets or inclinations really helps. So starting with matter, right? The first M of our 3 M's. How do I decide what to say? Let's use a very simple sample motion, right? If I say that this house regrets nationalism, by this house I mean that this gathering. House is essentially a gathering of people who have decided to debate on a particular topic. If I say this house regrets nationalism, and I'm supposed to speak for the motion, a topic in a debate is called a motion. You can either speak for it or you can either speak against it. You can't just keep switching in between. So saying that I regret nationalism or this house regrets nationalism, there are certain things that's expected of me to do, right? First is to define the terms. It's very similar to, for example, somebody asking you, why are you studying a particular course? You have to first define your ambitions, your inclinations towards that course. So similarly, you'd have to define what nationalism is. Is nationalism loving one's country? Yes or no? Louder, guys. No. Is patriotism loving one's country? Yes. So therein you have already established a very significant difference between being nationalistic and being patriotic. Being patriotic obviously means I love my country. Being nationalistic means I only love my country and I blindly love my country, right? And that's a good enough argument to present as your first argument in a debate which says this house regrets nationalism. Because what nationalism does is that it makes you blind. And the moment your love is blind, it becomes toxic, right? That's where the leaders of the world, the representatives who essentially take upon themselves the mantle to govern the world can tell you that, look, no matter what we do, it is your country, so you have to abide by everything we are doing and support it. So today, if you really don't want to support Article 370 because you think, or for that matter, the revocation of Article 370 because you think it is not right, simple as that, you can stand up and criticize the government. Because criticizing the government is not synonymous with criticizing the country, right? I'm criticizing the government because I think it is not doing its democratic job of actually governing well. So that's a point that falls on this house regrets nationalism. How do you oppose this motion? What do you say by agreeing to the fact that we should not regret nationalism? That is where you have to do a bit of semantic dovetailing, right? So what do I mean by semantic dovetailing? It's a fancy way of saying you have to be clever with words, right? It's very difficult to prove in any sort of debate, in any sort of argument, that an individual must stand by the country no matter what. But if you are opposing the motion saying this house regrets nationalism, or by actually saying that this house does not, what you have to say is that or what you can say is that there is no have-tos in debates, right? There is no one form of arguing. There are multiple forms of argumentation. It's what you think goes best that can win the day for you. So what do I say against the motion? One way to approach it is to talk about the context. Give the context of today's world. Talk about globalization. Talk about this process of acculturation. What is acculturation? Acculturation is a process whereby different cultures merge together to create a culture which has no unique resemblance to the original cultures it stemmed from. Talk about why that is a problem. Because once we do that, we start losing our identities. Now, you don't need to be a megalomaniac like a Donald Trump if you are saying that this house does not regret nationalism, right? You can actually say it in a very smooth, reasoned, reasonable manner. That look, every country has its own identity. In a hyper-globalized world, it's important to retain that identity. And over there, patriotism isn't enough. You can even go to the extent of saying that nationalism does not involve blindly supporting my country. It just means that I put my country's priorities first. It can be something as very simple as buying a homemade product, an indigenous product, instead of actually getting something from abroad. That is also an example of nationalism, right? Nationalism can be something as simple as, going beyond couch activism on Independence Day and not just letting it be with a WhatsApp status update or an Instagram picture of the Indian flag, right? It can be actually going out there and going to the grassroots and engaging with people. So this house does not regret nationalism, because in this situation, if we start regretting nationalism, we start going ahead and not fulfilling the duties that our state demands us to do. We get certain rights. There are a concomitant set of duties we must perform, right? So that is where you can change the complete narrative of the debate from nationalism being a word that apparently connotes authoritarian tendencies, that apparently suffocates individual agency, that apparently suffocates the idea that individuals have the right to criticize, to something that is good, something that is positive, something that creates change, something that creates greater national integration. So that's how you debate. You take a motion. There is always two sides of a coin, right? There is the thesis, thesis can be anything, it's just a term of describing one side of the story. There is a thesis, there is an antithesis. You as a debater should ideally arrive at a combination of these two, which is a synthesis, right? The moment you do that, you not only get the audience involved, you not only win over their sympathy, but you also come across as somebody who is reasonable. And that, I think, is very important in today's world, especially when we've got ministers saying that Einstein has discovered gravity, right? I mean, how many of you heard that yesterday? And he did not realize the gravity of that mistake, right? But that's where, when you're in public space, even if you're saying this to a friend, you must retain your rational faculties, right? Which is why it's very important. If you're being governed by, for the lack of a better term, naive people, then you must be intelligent to understand the naivety, right? So you must have been familiar with the ways a debate works, right? And before I progress, I'd just like to delineate between the two kinds of debating that you'll essentially be doing in your college days. There is a form of debating called the Oxford style of debating, or a conventional style of debating. What is that? That is essentially what Jefferson was. For those of you who were there at Jefferson debate last year and might be there for future editions, that was an example of an Oxford debate. Also an example of a successful American import of a British concept, right? An Oxford style debate is essentially a debate where you have a team that consists of two members, one member speaking for the motion, one member speaking against the motion. Usually you get 4+1, 3+1 minutes, 5+1 in rare instances to speak. And your scores are added up, and then whichever team has the highest score wins the debate, right? Now, an Oxford style debate usually requires a certain sense of rhetoric, a certain level of being able to entertain the audience, because it is an audience-based debate to a large extent. If my audience is bored, then I'm not really a successful Oxford debater, right? There is a Cambridge style of debating, which is essentially a 3-on-3. A Cambridge style is a 1v1 debate with 3 members on each side. So let's say there are 3 members for the motion, 3 members against the motion. There are no other teams for that debate, right? It's a one-on-one elimination. All those 3 members on one side speak for, all those 3 on the other side speak against. That is a proper team debate, because then you get to interact with your team members and actually make case together, instead of an Oxford style where, it's a lot of individual preparation, since both of you are speaking on the opposite sides of the stance. One mistake that people make during Oxford debates is that they actually cancel out the teammate's speech. So if I'm speaking against the motion, I end up going and rebutting exactly what my for speaker has said. That's not a good way to argue, because then you're bringing down the whole perception of your team, right? There are different strands of argumentation in Oxford debate, which I will get to eventually. The other kind of debating, barring Oxford and Cambridge, is what is called a parliamentary debate. It's not as bad as the debates in the Indian Parliament, right? Actual debating takes place over there. What that is about is, again, it's a 3-member versus 3-member team. But unlike the Cambridge format, which has an audience and which requires a certain level of eloquence and rhetoric and being public friendly, in a parliamentary debate, you can stutter through your speech and doesn't matter as long as you make sense, right? In parliamentary debates, you don't have fancy people coming and judging you, right? It's essentially your own peers, students who judge, and these judges are also competitive. They are called adjudicators, right? So these judges are involved in their own parallel competition, and maybe I can explain later on, if we have time, how a parliamentary debate works. But just for the basic information, there are judges who are essentially students who will adjudicate you, and then there are two teams who speak for the motion and against the motion. The emphasis being solely on reasoning, on argumentation, on structure, not at all on rhetoric. So if you give a very flowery speech, it doesn't really matter. If you stumble and stutter, it doesn't really matter, as long as you speak sense. These speeches are of 7 minutes, 20 seconds. So they are very substantive, right? You have to speak sense because there's only so much fluff you can accommodate in a speech. So how do you structure a thought? Essentially means understanding how much of it do you put in the statement. If you are making a statement, okay, let's take a very simple example, right? Something I think we all have been in, and if you haven't, I wish you are, is when you go out on a date and you want to propose to someone, right? How do you structure your thoughts? It's very difficult to do because you have that emotional whirlwind inside of you, right? So your partner has arrived. I'm going to use the pronoun she for my reference, but you can put in your own pronouns as you wish. So for example, the girl comes and sits at the coffee table. She's having coffee. This is like our 4th or 5th date. I sort of really like her and I want to tell her I love you, right? And let's date, as the concept is. That's also structuring of thought. How do I precisely say I love you? Do I just say I love you? Or do I just say, I want to spend the rest of my life with you? Or if I say something very crass as I want you to be the mother of my kids. So what do I say, right? How do I structure my thought? So the moment I say I want you to be the mother of my kids, the girl will just go away, right? At worst, she might just slap me and go away. Or block me or whatever. So that is structuring of thought. That is understanding what are the right words to say, right? It can be something as polite as, I think I've had a lot of fun interacting with you and I think we can go somewhere else. I think we're just more than friends. It's a very convenient phrase to use these days, more than friends, right? That is also a clever way of structuring a thought because that is tailoring your content based on your sensitivity, your sensibility, and your audience. So those are the 3 things that essentially involve structuring of thoughts. Even when you're writing answers, structuring of thoughts became very important when you're writing an answer, right? Because there has to be an introduction, there has to be a conclusion, there has to be a middle phase. So most literature answers or most substantive answers are essentially argumentative, right? Because you're supposed to give your opinion. I'm not talking about the school level because people, ratta maar ke ugal dete hai wahan par. But at college level, you need to stand out with your argumentation. So how do you do that? Structuring of thought is understanding which are the phrases that are extra, getting rid of those phrases, trying to make things as simple as possible, and at the same time not losing the logic. So if I go from A to Z, structuring of thought, a good structure of thought would tell the person I'm explaining to how I went from A to Z. So how I went through B, C, D, E, F and accordingly, right? In structuring of thought, a very common mistake we make is we mistake causation for correlation and vice versa. Can anybody tell me what is the difference between causation and correlation?
Causation in a sense is एक चीज से दूसरी चीज में जाना. Like you can give birth to other things. Like while you're talking about something, you can put on other subjects into it. But correlation is if I'm talking about you, I can talk about your friends as well. Like that relates to you.
Okay. Let's say there is an event and there are determinants or factors that might influence that event. Let's say the event is you have failed an exam. Okay. Now the determinants are, number 1, you did not study. Number 2, it was raining. Okay. Now, let's say on the day of the exam, it was raining, you go and give the exam and you fail the exam. And you tell me that, look, I failed the exam because it was raining. Now that is a correlation. There is no direct connection between it raining and you failing. But just because those 2 events happened simultaneously, or in some sort of chronological order, like either you failed and then it rained, or it rained and then you failed, right? You tend to think of it as something that's caused the other. Like if A happens after B, we think A happens because of B. In the inverse order, or B happens after A, we think that B happens because of A. That is not true. That is correlation. Causation is you did not study, so you failed. So there is a direct connection between the two events, right? Causation essentially is something that we should use as debaters or whenever we are arguing, because then we can directly connect one dot with the other, right? So today maybe a Hindutva fanatic will tell you that things are not going well because you don't have a pet cow, right? So that's an example of correlation. There is no logical connection between you having a pet cow and flourishing in life, right? Unless that cow gives you a lot of milk and you make a good business out of it. Then that becomes a causation, because you can connect the cow's influence to your own life. So make sure that whenever you're reasoning, arguing, debating, you can differentiate between a causation and a correlation. Because often what people will come and tell you in debates, especially when they will throw statistics at you, is that look, this country requires a dictatorship because the economy has slumped. That's no reason, right? I mean, the economy slumping is a bad thing. Having a dictatorship is a bad thing. But two bad things don't conjoin to be mutually justifiable, right? So that is where you need to realize, and that is where you need knowledge. That is where you need to understand how a particular society is working, how a particular situation is working, right? So therefore, keep in mind the difference between causation and correlation, because that is one of the most basic mistakes that people make, right? Okay. Now, getting to some basic aspects of how to argue. I'm still in the matter section, right? So how do you determine how much you speak, what you speak, and how you speak that, right? So let's say you're preparing for a debate. Let me give you another sample motion. The sample motion being that this house regrets the glorification of motherhood. Okay, the glorification of motherhood, as in, the whole idea ki being a mother is so noble, mothers can't make mistakes, mothers are beyond criticism, and that some people should just aspire to be mothers, that's it. So all of that falls in the ambit of glorification of motherhood, right? So if you're preparing for a debate like this, it is a controversial debate, because you have to take into account the sensitivities of your audience. You can't say things that are brutal or harsh, right? So as a debater, you have to be very sensitive also. So how do you approach a motion like this? Firstly, you should not start criticizing motherhood, right? That is not the focus of the debate. Whenever you're debating, you have a motion, go through the entire wording of the motion, find that one word in which the contention is placed. In this motion, what is that one word in which the contention is placed? That one word around which the debate will happen. Can anybody tell me? In the motion, this house regrets the glorification of motherhood. What is that one word around which the debate will revolve or should revolve? And it isn't motherhood. So what is that? Exactly, right? It's glorification. So that is the one word that will determine the course of your debate. What you mean by glorification, how much of glorification you think is necessary, and how much of glorification you think actually goes ahead and undermines the nobility of motherhood. And that's how you argue. So the first pointer that you have in your mind is, okay, I will define glorification. I will define what it means to be a mother in today's society, right? So then you start entering the whole frame of the debate. Then you start talking about things like mothers taking their positions for granted. So just because somebody has nurtured me does not mean then that person makes my decisions for me, right? When I grow up. That is an important point to understand. Of course, it's subjective. You can believe that no, maybe mothers have that leeway. But there is a common consensus logic, CCL, whatever, like this is just a fancy acronym. CCL, common consensus logic, that you need to use at debates. Now, you can't say things like, come up and say things like, for example, being in a toxic relationship is good. You as an individual might feel it's good. I mean, it's subjective, right? You might feel, if your girlfriend dumps you every second week and then gets back to you every third week, that's fine, right? That's okay to believe, because as an individual, tumhara hak hai, whatever you want to believe, right? But you can't say that at a public platform, because that does not abide by the codes of the CCL. Similarly, you can't come up and say things like, even as a woman, you can't come up and say things like, women should aspire to only be mothers. That's not an argument that works in today's world, because we very much have to look at the idea of equality, right? And the idea of agency. As a woman, you are not less of a woman if you think that I just want to be a mother. It's an individual choice. If you've made that choice with your conscious deliberation that I want to be a homemaker, there is no problem with that. But you can't enforce that narrative on a society and say all women should be mothers and being mother is the primary identity of a woman. You can't say that, right? Because it comes to the individual agency of a woman to determine what identity she wants to assert for herself. So that level of agency is very important when you're debating. You need to be sensitive to those aspects of society, the whole societal narrative, right? So when you're structuring your thoughts, when you're penning things down, a very simple thing to do is actually just write down phrases. Never write an entire speech and just memorize it or just look at it and, elocute. Debating is not elocuting. You're not reciting an essay that you've written. Debating has to be spontaneous also. But at the same time, we can't just all come up with reasons on the lectern, right? So note down phrases, make bullet points. That's what I prefer. And, program your speech according to those bullet points. Always remember that it's better to use 3 very good points than 5 ordinary points in a debate speech. Because those 3 good points need time to sink into your audience. Now, you have reasoned those points in your head, so you already know what they sound like, you already know what their meanings are. But your audience hasn't. So they need time to explain, to understand that concept. Suddenly, if I start telling you about, how many of you are aware of the concept of dialectical materialism, Karl Marx? So dialectical materialism essentially is a concept that talks about how societies evolve, right? It brings in the concept of a node and an internode. What is that supposed to mean? So Marx believed that every society reaches a climax, a culmination point after which it is bound to fall and disintegrate. That is how the feudal system essentially gave way to capitalism, and Marx had hoped that capitalism would eventually give way to socialism. Socialism would give way to communism, and then communism would essentially give way to a society where there are no structures, where everything is mobile and everything is linear, right? And everything is uniform. That is obviously a utopia. That's what we call the Marxist utopia. Now, dialectical materialism as a concept essentially rests on the idea, it's a very complicated concept, of course. It's a very academic concept. It rests on the idea that society evolves. There is a node. That node goes through different internodes, and then you arrive at a culmination, after which a new stage or a new epoch begins. What if I don't know what dialectical materialism means? How do I answer, right? What if this is a job interview and your job is on the line and somebody asks you what is dialectical materialism because they were just reading the Das Kapital yesterday while you were watching Friends, right? So what do? You break down the term. Everybody knows what materialism means. Also, most of us with a decent vocabulary know what dialectics are, right? It's just 2 sides of the same concept. Dialectics, dual dialectics. Just say that, right? Say something like dialectical materialism is the idea that there are always 2 sides to the idea of acquisition, to the acquisitive tendencies of a market, right? You can even say something like dialectical materialism operates on the ideas of demand and supply, because it does, right? It may not do so according to the Marxist doctrine, but it does if you break down the concept. So understand how to take concepts, make them your own, not in the way that, like Indian politicians do by their pseudoscience, but in a very theoretical way, try and break down words, because you will get fancy words at certain debates. For example, I was once at a debate where one of my teammates, this was at SRCC, one of my teammates used the word retrospective determinism. Retrospective determinism. The opponents were flabbergasted. They were like, "Ye kya hai bhai? Mujhe pata nahi hai ye." So they stopped debating. Retrospective determinism is just a fancy word for hindsight. Everybody knows what hindsight is, right? If you break down the words retrospective and determinism, you will understand how it actually translates into hindsight. So that's also what debaters do. Sometimes when they run out of logic, or even if they have loads of logic, they will just overwhelm you with their vocabulary. They will use words which you've never heard of. So don't be intimidated. Ideally, good debaters should not resort to flowery language, because the idea is to transmit a particular message to the audience, and that usually doesn't happen if you start using esoteric vocabulary, right? So understanding that we have arrived at a situation where more or less our matter is in place, like how to argue. We know that we'll have to bullet list points, never write down a speech, never memorize a speech. We know that structuring of thought is essentially the most economic way of putting together what we want to say, and at the same time, if it can be appealing, great. We've also known that when we're trying to figure out a motion, the most important thing is to arrive at the contentious word and then weave our arguments around it. Now, the whole aspect of manner. Manner and method are kind of similar. Manner is the way you speak. Method is the whole procedure, or the modus operandi, as it were. So what sort of manner should you take? And again, there is no right answer to this. Everybody has their own style. You will see speakers who are very vigorous, who are very aggressive, who address you as if you were their vote bank and they're at a political rally. So they will start shouting, they will start raising their voice. There are speakers who can shout also very sophisticatedly, right? So you won't even realize that they're shouting, but the decibels levels have crossed, right? There are also speakers who will speak very softly, very subtly. They will insinuate their ideas into your minds. So that's also another form of speaking. I think individually as speakers, it's about recognizing which style suits you best, which style you are most comfortable with. Of course, there are certain situations where the audience will demand a certain style. What do I mean by that? So if I'm addressing a gathering of 200 people, I won't speak with the same tone as I would have if I were addressing a gathering of 10 people, right? So that is where you have to modulate your voices and do so cleverly. So when you're talking about manner, your voice matters a lot. Doesn't mean you have to be melodious, doesn't mean you have to be very soothing to the ear, but at the same time, don't speak harshly, right? Don't use harsh words. By harsh words, I just don't mean expletives. Of course, you can't use expletives at a public speaking session, right? Or at a debate. But try and understand what is the right tone for you to hit. Try and moderate that tone as you are speaking. So let's take the example of a good song, right? A good song involves intonation. If the singer were to sing at the same pitch throughout the song, you'd get bored. It won't be a very good song. It involves certain portions where the singer is toning it down, almost a cadence, and then there are certain portions where it really goes up, the pitch really goes up, the volume goes up, the intensity goes up. That's similar with respect to a speech. A speech has rhythms. If you listen to the great speeches of the world, the great speakers of the world, not debaters, great speakers of the world, the likes of Barack Obama, if you go back to Martin Luther King, Jawaharlal Nehru. How many of you have heard Jawaharlal Nehru's speech, Tryst with Destiny? Right? A few of you have, right? I mean, that's also a very good example of a good speech. How many of you, I really recommend listening to this. This is a Shashi Tharoor speech given at Oxford Union, where he debated on the motion, this house believes that Britain owes its colonies reparations. This was trending sometime in 2015, even Narendra Modi had shared that. Really listen to that speech if you haven't, right? That's a very good example. In fact, any Shashi Tharoor speech, I personally love him, although I don't necessarily condone everything that he's done, right? That's a very good example of a powerful speech. Even Maggie Hassan. Maggie Hassan is a good example of how to be a fiery debater and yet not put your audience off. Maggie Hassan is an Al Jazeera journalist. He also debates very frequently. So if you really want to become a good speaker, look at different speeches, because you cannot learn in isolation. It's not like you've been blessed with, God has come like, haan, tumhara ye shakti hai, log. So not like that. It doesn't work like that. You have to inculcate certain faculties in yourself. You have to learn from others. I have learned a lot from my fellow debaters, right? Looking at people debating, whether they've been my teammates, whether they've been my opponents. I've looked at their styles. I've tried to incorporate certain elements of their style into my style of debating, and I've gotten better that way. So always keep an open mind and learn from the people around you. Next thing is body language, right? If you're speaking, and usually if you're speaking at debates, you will have to confine yourself to the lectern. You can't go wandering around and, walking around the aisle. So if you're speaking at a lectern, how should you stand? Yeah. I mean, for starters, you should stand in a confident posture, even if your heart is racing, right? If you're afraid, don't let it show. I mean, we all are afraid, right? We've all been nervous. It's very common to be nervous. It's also okay to be nervous, especially if you're in your initial debates, your initial areas of public speaking, because public speaking requires a lot of courage, right? Even if you know it, just standing there and having the fear of being judged requires a lot of courage, a lot of gusto. So when you're speaking to an audience, always make sure you maintain eye contact with them. Now, usually in a particular speech of 4 to 5 minutes, it's difficult to look at the entire audience. You don't have to check out the entire audience, of course. You can just focus your gaze on somebody who you think is giving you a nice reciprocation. Like somebody who either has a pretty stable expression or maybe looking favorably upon your speech. So try and locate that, and that happens naturally. You don't have to tell your brain. It's just subconscious. It happens naturally, where your eyes will rest on somebody in the audience who's looking at you favorably, right? Even if somebody isn't, even if people at the back are like laughing and like, ye kya bol raha hai bhai, and stuff like that. Just look at the wall. Just look at, because the wall can't react, right? So it won't put you off with their expressions. So make sure your gaze is moving. It's not fixed, but it's also kind of stable. You're looking up. What do you do with your hands, right? That's a very important question at different stages of our lives. What to do with our hands? So ideally, like I like to keep them in the lectern. There are people who will use their hands while they're arguing in a sort of hypnotic way to try and lure you into their argumentation. Like I've seen people who do that very effectively, like the use of the index finger particularly. If you want to do that, great. If you want to just rest your hands on the lectern, great. There will be lecterns at which your hands won't be visible, but don't like stand in an attention position and deliver a speech. You should be comfortable, like, space out your legs, bend your knees slightly if you want to, but make sure the posture you adopt is a posture that is comfortable, because even if you may not realize it, body language, it's more about self-comfort than anything else, right? In terms of addressing an audience, like something simple as, me just rolling my hand into my pocket. That's also a sign of comfort. That's also a sign of me being relaxed. So when you're addressing a gathering where it's more casual, which I would like to believe this is, which is why I sort of distance myself from the lectern. And if I'm just strolling down the aisle, strolling down the stage and speaking, again, it's very important to feel relaxed. It's important to know that your audience is relaxed, right? Because sometimes you will have very hostile audiences, right? Especially if you go to debate in certain colleges and they fill up the gallery with a whole lot of people from their college, there will be a certain amount of hostility you will have to deal with. So a way to overcome that is humor, a way to overcome that is body language. So now getting to something that is very cardinal with respect to public speaking, the idea of humor, right? So let me give you an example of humor. So let's say I'm at a debate, right, where we are discussing dissent, right, the right to dissent. And I crack a joke by saying that this phone of mine, is a political phone. If I say Modi, Modi, it goes into flight mode. If I say Arnab, Arnab, it goes into loudspeaker. If I say Boris, Boris, it exits all the apps. If I say Manmohan, Manmohan, it goes into silent. And if I say Rahul, Rahul, it switches off. Okay. So, of course, you can't crack it everywhere because some campuses are politically very, stringent with respect to the kind of jokes you crack. But, this joke I would use as an example of saying, and this in fact happened at a debate at Bhawanipur, where I used this joke to say that, look, this is an example of the fact that I can still assert my dissent. If I want to criticize, I can still do that. So there are different ways of cracking jokes. There are different ways of being funny. Some people are just funny in the way they speak, not necessarily in terms of a particular content, not necessarily in terms of a punchline. But the idea of humor is that you have to be comfortable cracking the joke. Now, not all of us are stand-up comedians, and public speakers are not supposed to be stand-up comedians either. But it's about realizing that your audience needs a break. Sometimes humor is the best way to incorporate somebody, some idea, right? It's like today, for example, earlier today, let's imagine a hypothetical scenario where a particular individual was asking me the difference between irony, sarcasm, and understatement. So let's assume I want to communicate the idea to that person that, look, you are very dumb if you don't know these three concepts. How do I use humor to say that, right? Firstly, I tell the person that, look, you are smart and this is an example of sarcasm. Secondly, you are stupid and that is an understatement. Thirdly, I am speaking to you and still interested in you, that's an irony, right? So that's very savage humor, right? But sometimes you need to be savage at debates because your opponents are going to be. But even if you're savage, never take something and really personally take jibes at individuals, right? You can attack their qualities, you can attack their attributes, but don't attack something that does not involve the debating framework. So don't attack their looks, don't attack their dressing, don't attack their origins, their families, whatever, right? Absolutely not. Strict no. You'll be disqualified immediately, and that just goes against the ethics of public speaking. Also understand that there will be debates where you will get very heated up. It's natural to get heated up because there is a lot of intellectual riling that's going on. How do you control yourself in those moments? Firstly, understand that the principle at which debaters arrive to debate is that they have agreed to disagree. knowing that they have agreed to disagree, there is a certain level of decorum that needs to be maintained in debates. Like, don't turn debating houses into parliaments, essentially, right? Also, make sure that when you're debating, you're not debating with an attitude of condescendence. You know, like, I know it all. There's a difference between being confident, cocky. You can also be cocky at certain debates, you know. Sometimes you just have to be because you have to stand out. Especially at Oxford debates where the speakers in front of you or the speakers who speak before you have taken all your points. You know, there are Oxford debates and iLEAD, for example, the Jefferson debate had, I think, around 15 to 16 teams, right? So it was the same motion. Now, there are only so many points you can use in a debate. But how do you stand out if you're the 16th team, right? And everybody has taken all the points before you. Sometimes you might need to be slightly cocky in order to assert the fact that you're really confident. And that's okay. That's your personal choice. But don't let that cockiness or that apparent arrogance spill over into condescendence or, for that matter, insulting behavior towards your opponents, right? So always keep that in mind. Like, I've had debaters who've come up and said, you know, who've taken a pencil, broken the nib of the pencil and said, this pencil represents the arguments of my opponents, utterly pointless, right? That's a crass way of providing humor, right? So if you want to be subtle, be subtle. Humor is not necessary, it's not a prerequisite, but if you can incorporate it, great, because it adds as a good breathing space for the audience. It makes you more entertaining. Do you have any questions at this stage? Because this is like the end of the first part. I mean, I should wrap up by 1. Or like, if you want me to wrap up earlier, that's okay, but I think I'll probably wrap up by 1. If you have any questions at this stage, please ask me. Because I would like to, you know, answer questions. I had a lot of questions when I was getting to know the basics of debating. No, any questions at this stage?
So Priyam, I have a question.
Yeah.
The question which I want to ask, when we go for debates, right, we get like very limited amount of time. So people who are not that much into current affairs or don't read newspapers every day, how do they write about the topic in that given amount of time?
That's something that we've all faced, right? Time is of the essence. Now, 2 things. Firstly, you need to understand what you need to know about a motion once a motion is given. So, like, very simple example, right? If suddenly I'm given a motion that deals with current affairs, let's say I'm given the motion that this house believes that the United States should not withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. Okay, like, they're in the context is the US is in talks of trying to get troops out of Afghanistan because things haven't worked out, and Donald Trump apparently believes like the Taliban is dead, like the aggressive wing of the Taliban is dead, but they still have to negotiate with the Taliban to get out of Afghanistan, right? So suppose I don't know this, I get this motion, what on earth do I say? To begin with, I just look at very basic concepts, right? What does a withdrawal of troops entail? Now, even if somebody does not understand current affairs or does not know the intricacies of the US-Afghanistan situation, they know that withdrawal of troops is actually a benefit for the country who is withdrawing the troops, right? That's a good thing. Usually, if you withdraw troops, it means you have more arsenal at your disposal. Your soldiers come back to their homeland. You are not essentially involved in turmoil elsewhere. Very basic points. 3 very basic points that makes prop case or proposition case that we should withdraw troops. Something as simple as, you know, concocting a story, and sometimes you have to concoct stories, guys, right, in debates. But you talk about a US soldier who just wants to be back in his country because he's been there for years in Afghanistan and things haven't turned out well, right? That's also an argument. So try and think very basic logic, right? You don't even have to think knowledge. Then, of course, there will become a time when you will start panicking, right? You're like, I don't have enough points. I won't be able to speak for the duration of the time. So what do you do when you don't have enough points? You take one point and then try and reach its culmination. What do I mean by that? I'll give you a simple example. Let's use a motion like, although this is not pertinent to college level debates, but this is something that comes to my mind straight off. This house believes that students should not wear uniforms in school, or this house would get rid of uniforms in school, right? So how many of you hated uniforms while in school? Yeah, so the majority of the people, right? I also did to a certain extent, especially if your school does not have a very good fashion sense, right? They'll make you wear whatever. So how do we debate this motion? Let's say you're a complete novice, you don't understand how argumentation works. You take one point, like you just have got one point saying that this house, you're saying for the motion, saying this house shouldn't wear uniforms to school because it does not give me freedom to dress however I want. Okay, this is a very basic point. Like even if you ask a class 6 kid and ask him, do you hate uniforms? And if he says yes, his most probable answer or his most probable reasoning would be that, look, mujhe jo pehna hai, I can't wear, right? So that's freedom of dressing. You have this one point, you have to speak 5 minutes on it. How will you speak? Thing is, you start extending the point. How do you extend a point? At every point that you have a point, you ask yourself why. Simple, right? So if I ask myself, if I say that I don't have the freedom to dress, which is why I don't like uniforms. Why? Why do I not have the freedom to dress? Very simple question. Simple answer to that is because the school imposes this uniform on me. Why does the school impose this uniform on me? Because the school wants a certain amount of discipline. Why does the school want a certain amount of discipline? Because discipline is necessary to an academic environment. Why is discipline necessary to an academic environment? Because otherwise there would be anarchy among students who don't necessarily know how to conduct themselves because they are young, right? That's when you reach a culmination of that point. Now you start weighing up the pros and cons. You start weighing up discipline alongside freedom. So that's your one narrative of the debate. That is the primary narrative around which this debate revolves. Discipline versus freedom. How do you weigh these two up? Where do you strike the balance? Second narrative of the debate. Maturity of the students versus imposition from the authorities. Like at what level does this create a slippery slope? What is the slippery slope? A slippery slope is if somebody steals your wallet today, tomorrow they will rob your house. That's the kind of idea. That if you let them get away with this, they will do much more than that, right? So, in a slippery slope, if you start arguing that if a school starts imposing what you wear, and this is not with respect to a particular school, this is the idea of the schooling system. If the school starts imposing on you what you wear, they might start imposing on you things like your food habits, the kind of language you should speak, the kind of pages you should follow on Facebook, the kind of content you should be believing in, your philosophy. So the school essentially starts indoctrinating you. So do you see how I've gone from the school imposing a dress code to indoctrination? And that's a logical connection you have to make. Obviously, you won't be able to do it right away at your first debate. It takes experience. But the moment you start asking yourself why, right, you will arrive at answers. That's the best way to find points. If you don't have knowledge, just ask yourself why. Let's say you wake up on a particular day and you don't want to go to college, right? You're like, I'm lazy. Ask yourself, why are you lazy? Then you'll probably realize that maybe you overslept, maybe you did not sleep, maybe you haven't had a proper diet, maybe you don't like a particular professor, so you don't want to attend a particular class. So the moment you ask yourself why, you will get more context about yourself. Essentially, you will generate knowledge. Because knowledge is like a hard drive. It's always there in our brain. Of course, you can add to it, but there is content that is waiting to be explored. The moment you ask yourself why, that is when you start inserting a USB into that hard drive and importing content from it into your brain so that you can speak or write or do whatever. So asking why is the best way to find arguments when you are short of points at a debate, right? So this is one of those debating conundrums, right? Ideally, what happens is in an Oxford debate, you get to choose, as in you can consult with your teammate and decide which stance you want to take, right? But sometimes it might so happen that you still end up with a stance you don't believe in, right? So let's say if I have to defend the idea of the NDA government, I don't believe the NDA government has done a good job, but I have to defend it, right? How do I do that? At one level, this is easier because this does not involve my emotions so much. It's a political opinion, right? But if I have to defend something like, let's say, the practice of polyamory. Polyamory is having multiple romantic partners at the same time. Of course, telling all of them that koi aur bhi hai. Not like keeping them secretly and then they'll discover your deleted chats and then find out. No stuff like that. So, how do I defend polyamory if I'm a monogamous person? That requires me to completely shift out of my emotional zone. And that is something that debaters have to do. There is no reason I can give you or there is no method I can suggest, but all I can say is that this is required of a debater. A debater is like an actor. He or she puts on different masks at different stages and convinces the audience that the mask is the mirror, right? And of course, there will be times when you just struggle to come up with ideas because your brain can't accept the fact that you are essentially arguing for it, right? Or speaking in favor of a concept that you hate as an individual. One way to do it is to just use the points that you use to hate that concept and then turn them upside down. So let's say if I hate, for example, the idea of polyamory, or if I'm against the idea of polyamory, What is the first thing that I don't like? I believe that love gets diluted if it's distributed. Simple concept. Right? If I turn this concept, I can say that love gets enhanced if it's shared. Very simple. It's just using opposite vocabulary. That's also a way of generating ideas. Use the same points that you would have in order to denounce a concept, and if you have to promote it, just change the vocabulary, use opposite words, antonyms, and just promote it. But yeah, there will be times when you face ethical quandary, especially in parliamentary debates where emotions tend to be really nuanced. You sometimes have to defend things like ethnic cleansing. Right? You sometimes have to defend things like genocide. You have to defend things like there was this motion which says that in order to control the population, the government will fill the water supply of a country with a drug that prevents women from being conceived or for conceiving for the second time. Okay, I mean, it's obviously a very hypothetical concept, but imagine there is a drug which is leased into the water supply of a system that does not allow women to conceive a second child, and you as the government have to sanction it and have to defend it that this is something I will do because I need to control my population. And worse still, you won't even make this public. Like your people, your citizens won't even know. How do you defend something like this? Because this goes directly against agency, right? The right to reproduce is an individual right. Everybody has the right to do it. I can mandate it. Like, for example, China had one child policy for a long time. But I cannot go ahead and prevent people from conceiving and not even tell them about it, right? So very difficult to defend. But then what do? You do something which is called utilitarianism. Greater good for the greatest number. Utilitarianism is a very common debating concept, and I think this question is sort of a convenient question because I can enter debating concepts with it. The first idea that I'm going to talk to you about is utilitarianism. The idea that it's okay to sacrifice the interests of a few to cater to the interests of many. And that is something you will end up facing at some stage of your debating career. Let me give you an example to illustrate this, and I really want your engagement for this example. It's simple. You are driving a car, okay? Or let's say you're driving a train, because car though has, like, you can go on a road. You're driving a train, the train obviously has to follow a track, right? You arrive at a crossroads. The train's brakes have failed, like there is no way you can press a brake, right? You arrive at a crossroads. On one side, you have this one individual who's standing. At another side, you have 10 people who are standing, right? Now, the brakes have failed. If you let the vehicle take its natural course, it will, and please pay attention guys, because this is slightly nuanced. If you let the vehicle take its natural course, it will clash into the 10 people and kill them all, right? If you deviate or if you steer the vehicle towards the other track, the one person will die. If the 10 people die, society will believe it's not your fault because you let the vehicle go. You let it take its natural course, the brakes had failed. If you kill the one person, then it's your fault. Like, you will have to own up for it. But then you're saving 10 lives. So what do? Just a repeat of the situation for those of you who didn't get it the first time. You are in charge of a vehicle whose brakes have failed. You have arrived at a crossroads. You can't be like, no, I will just get out of the vehicle. That is not an option here. You may do it in real life, but it's not an option in this debate. Do you let the vehicle take its natural course and kill 10 people where you have no responsibility, where you will not have any culpability? Or do you steer the vehicle to the other side and kill just one individual, save 10 lives, but take the blame upon yourself? So I guess, okay, so raising of hands, right? How many of you would swerve the vehicle and kill the one person to save 10 lives? How many of you would kill the one person to save 10 lives? No, we are not talking about saving yourself. You would be alive anyway. Just another showing of hands, please. How many of you would save those 10 people and kill the one individual knowing it's your individual responsibility? Okay, so that's about like what, 30%? How many of you would do the opposite? How many of you would just let the vehicle go, take its course and kill the 10 people off?
I know it sounds funny, but to put all of this in a practical aspect, see, people in this world die all the time. But okay, what if you just let that one person die? You will be, I think this was an ethics questions, Cambridge or Wharton, I don't remember, I saw it somewhere on YouTube. So this is like an ethics related question.
Yeah.
So the thing is that when that one person is dying, you will be held accountable.
Yeah, so essentially you want to preserve your own...
Yeah.
Safety, fair enough.
Maybe the one person is very important to someone, like he's dependent. Someone is dependent to
No,
him.
you don't know the context. It's not like, so obviously if on that side, like if one of my relatives or if a friend of mine or if my lover or if my parent was standing and obviously saved them,
If I
that's
kill 10
understandable.
people, then I won't be responsible. Like I am going with the flow. So
Fine.
maybe.
I have another point.
Yeah.
Because those 10 people were standing in the natural course of the train. So I don't feel that deviating the course would be fair to save one life.
I think that's a very good point, right? Why? Because that tells you, so understand the situation, right? The situation is not your fault. Like you did not create that conundrum where there are people on one side, one person on the other side. It's purely circumstantial. So in order to attain what is natural justice, you let the circumstance climax. You let it take its natural course and you let the 10 people die. The moment you swerve the train, save the 10 people and kill that one person, you are essentially intervening in the natural circumstance, right? Now, what is the idea that says you should intervene? It's a simple idea of mathematics that saving 10 lives, this is a situation where you know nothing about those 11 people involved. You know nothing about their context, you know nothing about their talents. Maybe the one person you're killing off could have been an Einstein, right? It could have been, or he could just have been a pauper. You never know. And on the same side, on the other side, those 10 people could be just, maybe 10 people who were planning to loot a bank. It can be anything. You have no idea, you have no knowledge. In a situation where you have like a tabula rasa, a blank slate about their knowledge, what do? If you are intervening, you're essentially propounding the concept of utilitarianism. Greater good for the greater number. The idea that when I do not have context, I will simply go for what is more mathematically feasible. So pure probability tells me that 10 people, by sheer volume, have a better chance of contributing more to society than one person does. So thereby, I'll go ahead and save those 10 people and kill the one person, even if that involves personal culpability. Now understand, when you're thinking about a motion like this, you don't necessarily think of yourself as an individual only. Like you just don't think like, oh, मैं तो jail में चला जाऊंगा, फिर क्या होगा? No, not that sort of stuff, right? It's an ethical dilemma. It's the kind of dilemma that governments often face, right? And governments can be culpable in the sense of perception. They're not always going to be culpable in terms of law, right? So that's essentially the kind of idea. I mean, look at, let's say, a situation like the emergency in 1975, right? When Indira Gandhi imposed the emergency, what was the narrative that came out in the public? Leave aside the personal motivations. The narrative was that there were a few people who were causing trouble to the interests of a larger society. So in order to keep the larger society stable, at bay, safe, we imprisoned these people, and there was a lot of torture that happened with these select few people because they were causing problems to a greater society. That is an example of utilitarianism at work. Maybe not a great example, maybe not a healthy example, but an example nonetheless. So this is one of the ways in which you initiate your thought process. Another, I'll just do one more sample example, and I think this is more interesting. Listen to this carefully. I'm going to use some fancy names to spice up the plot. Okay. So imagine there is this guy called Ranveer. Not Ranveer Singh, just a guy called Ranveer. He you can hear me right at the back? Yeah. So there's this guy called Ranveer who has an accident. Now Ranveer is out on a trip. He's on a business trip, and at home he has his wife who is, let's call her Anushka. Okay. So at home there is Anushka. Ranveer has an accident. They're married. They're in love. Anushka obviously doesn't know that Ranveer has had an accident. Now Ranveer would have died had he not been saved by another woman. This woman's name is called Deepika, right? So Deepika comes, saves Ranveer, takes him to the hospital, makes sure that Ranveer survives, he gets the treatment. Now the thing is, in the process of recovering, Ranveer loses his memory. He does not remember anything. But Deepika starts falling in love with Ranveer. Like, Now, so what happens is, once Ranveer is conscious and once he starts recovering, but he hasn't got his memory back, Deepika decides that she's going to be opportunistic. So she tells Ranveer that I am your wife, right? That we are in love and that we've been living together. Now Ranveer doesn't really, dislike Deepika, and over the course of time, he also starts liking her, and they have fallen in love, and they have lived together for 5 years. Anushka has no idea what's gone on with her husband. She's probably accepted the fact that Ranveer is dead. Maybe she has had another person in her life. Yeah, maybe his name is Virat, right? Just imagine that scenario. Now, 5 years later, 5 years after Ranveer has stayed with Deepika and he's happy, he suddenly starts getting his memory back. He suddenly starts remembering that he actually had a wife named Anushka, right? Now, in a situation, and this was an actual debate motion, in a situation where you are Ranveer, where you have just got your memory back that you have a wife called Anushka, but you are now married to Deepika and happily married to Deepika and you still love her, but you realize she has deceived you, what would you do? Would you go back to Anushka or would you stay with Deepika? Don't give me the answer based on who you find more attractive, okay? Like Deepika or Anushka. Just give me an ethical answer. What would you? And there is no right answer again. Okay.
Raise of hands for your
Raise
answer.
of hands. Tell me points. Why would you do it?
I'd rather go back to Anushka because had Deepika truly loved me, she would have been purely honest about everything.
That's a good point. Yeah. So again, you see that the same principles of letting natural course take its place and utilitarianism, while they were mutually antagonistic in the previous example, like natural course taking its place would have been 10 people dying. Utilitarianism would have been 10 people still alive. In this example, the two of them are on the same side. Natural course is staying with Deepika because that's how things have happened. Utilitarianism is also staying with Deepika because that's how things have happened. But emotional integrity, again that's very subjective, might necessitate you going back to Anushka because you realize that there has been a grave injustice that's done to Anushka. Anushka is thinking that my husband's probably gone missing or dead. She may have moved on, but she deserves the truth. Maybe if Ranveer goes back and Anushka's like, no, I don't like you anymore because Virat is there now or whatever, right? That's okay, but the choice to go back should take place on the grounds of emotional integrity because that is essentially the concept of justice, right? That is being true and morally righteous because you know that truth is denied to somebody who's a very important stakeholder in the whole concept, right? So a lot of debating concepts come across these things, right? Utilitarianism, the idea of agency, the idea of intervention, the idea of stakeholders. Stakeholders essentially, I mean, it's a corporate term, but in a situation it means anybody who is influenced by the outcome of a particular event, right? So that's how things go. So when it comes to debating concepts, another concept that I would like to talk about is the idea of an echo chamber. In a simple situation where you have to, let's say, weigh up Messi versus Ronaldo, let's say you're having the debate, right? You have a lot of fans for Messi and Ronaldo who are very idealistic. Like they can't take any criticism about Messi if they're a Messi lover. Similarly, they can't admit to a single strength or attribute of Cristiano Ronaldo. That is what essentially is an echo chamber. So what is an echo chamber? An echo chamber is when you are surrounded in a pool or let's say literally a chamber of ideas where you have no space for another idea to enter, right? And an echo chamber is very dangerous, maybe harmless with respect to Messi or Ronaldo, but it becomes very important in understanding certain very deeply embedded social phenomena. For example, patriarchy, right? Patriarchy is an example of a very successful, even though malicious echo chamber that has been perpetrated for a very, very long time. So the idea that women should not work, right? That women are meant to take care of the house is a patriarchal idea, obviously. It's been part of the patriarchal echo chamber. Why? Because, and this is, let's say, the idea of Indian society at the start of the 20th century, where patriarchy was flourishing. And the idea that a woman working was considered to be unhealthy. It was looked down upon, it was even castigated in certain scenarios. When you have influences of the Western education system, now I'm not in any way saying that the West made us less patriarchal. They did not. The British collaborated with the Indians to perpetuate patriarchy. But the Western idea or just the idea of open education, education for all, is a direct challenge to this echo chamber. Often enough, this idea of women being educated wasn't being allowed to enter the framework of social understanding. Because the moment women start getting educated, they start getting agency. That's when they start realizing they have different options than just being a homemaker, right? That is, their identity is not circumscribed by the idea of raising a family. In that sort of a situation, you have a perfect example of the echo chamber breaking. Because you have new ideas that are entering the system, right? Similarly, hatred for Pakistan, that is really doing the rounds, and Arnab Goswami has no qualms in raising those tensions, right? You listen to him at 9 every day, at 10, he's shouting, he's screaming, he's saying all sorts of things. He said, like, I found it deplorable personally when he said that we'll go to Lahore, destroy the city, and take back things from there as memorabilia. I mean, that's disgusting. But for people who, let's say, started out not as a Pakistan hater, this idea can be normalized. Why? Because they are not listening to the other side of the story. If somebody only watches the Republic, and this is a republic that has no autonomy, because you know how the financing works, right? If somebody only watches the Republic and maybe they don't watch other channels like NDTV or India Today, which are more left of center, which are, let's say, even there is no media channel which is neutral, right? But which are more left of center, they start getting normalized with the idea that Pakistan should be hated. Whether Pakistan should be hated or not is not what I'm trying to say here. I'm saying they accept the idea that it's okay to hate Pakistan till they reach a point where they start getting encouraged to hate Pakistan, right? That is how an echo chamber generates, when you don't allow any other ideas to enter that particular space. So as debaters, always be very aware of an echo chamber. I'll tell you something, we all are victims of echo chambers in a particular way because the Facebook algorithm is a very successful example of an echo chamber. How is that? The moment you like a page, and that's okay with brands, that's okay with musicians, footballers, but let's say political pages. The moment, let's say, I press a like on the BJP Facebook page, automatically I'll be exposed to more right-wing content. And I won't even realize when the time arrives when my entire newsfeed is just full of right-wing propaganda. And slowly, as somebody who was a centrist, as somebody who did not even understand what left, right and center mean in a political framework, I have been indoctrinated very insidiously as a right-winger. Right? So that is how algorithms work, because they work on the principle of echo chamber. As debaters, as thinkers, it's very important to understand and be aware of that, right? That does not mean, you just go and like all different kinds of pages of the political spectrum on Facebook. That just means that whenever somebody is speaking, hear what they have to say, even if the idea seems very outlandish to you. Like, if you don't give a voice to the people who are against you, you will never arrive at a way to challenge their proposals or to challenge their ideas. So keep that in mind. Debating, essentially, if you look at something larger as an activity that is more than just winning trophies, that is more than just garnering attention, it comes down to social discourse, right? Like, the reason why we debate is because we want to arrive at a particular narrative, even if we don't arrive at a solution. That is why, people say that it's better to settle a question without debating it, or rather it's better to debate a question without settling it than to settle a question without debating it, right? So fundamental questions, fundamental quandaries come into play when this happens. So, for example, I don't know how many of you saw, so there was this Quint video, Quint is this media channel, which produced a video talking about the rape culture in Haryana. This was a few years ago, right? And if you listen to those people, you will, like, your blood will start to boil, because they say things like, aisa to hoga hai. This is very normal. And it's the girls' fault because the girls, insinuate people. School children, class 7 or 8 school children saying things like, yeah, this is normal, right? Yeah, even the girls saying this, like, no, like, this is our fault. So how do you deal with a situation like that? First thing is you listen to what they have to say, right? You understand why they are saying this. There's always a reason why they are saying this, right? Even if they can't articulate it, you can get it out of them. Then you start understanding how deeply embedded patriarchy is, how objectified women have become in that part of the country, how undermined is their concept of agency, how much is the fear of something like, honor killings, right? The whole concept that if a woman goes ahead and, has physical relations with even her boyfriend, that can result in honor killing. A few days ago, I think this is probably from Saudi Arabia or somewhere in the Arab world, where a woman was killed by her own family members because she posted a picture of her along with her partner on Instagram. Like, she was killed because of that. Right? So why do these things happen, right? These things, a lot of baffling things happen around us in the world. There are plenty of wonderful things, but there are plenty of horrendous things. There is a reason why this happens. So we should always be open to reading extreme ideas, right? I mean, it's sad to see that today a judicial authority like the Bombay High Court decides to use evidence that somebody was having war and peace at home to try and incriminate them. But understand, just because I have read Mein Kampf doesn't mean I am a racist, doesn't mean I sympathize with Adolf Hitler. In fact, in order to counter him, I need to know what he's saying. Right? So Hitler actually believed, like, he had whitewashed himself into believing that the Jews were bad for the Germans, right? And he had convinced the Germans too. Now, to tie it back to my whole difference of correlation and causation, In certain debates, I have seen people defending Nazism, defending Adolf Hitler's regime in Germany by saying that he removed unemployment. And he actually did. There was no unemployment for a good 3, 4, 5 years in the 1930s in Germany. But that is no grounds for defending Nazism. Just because a Nazist regime removed unemployment doesn't mean that a Nazist regime equals economic sufficiency or self-sufficiency, right? That's a correlation. But to say that a Nazist regime is bad because of what they meted out to the Jews is a causation, because like the ideology itself has racist overpinnings, right? So how do you improve? And as speakers, as thinkers, as debaters, anything in life, there is no sense of stagnation, right? You have to improve all the time. How do you get better? How do you do your research? As Talha raised the question when he said that, sometimes we don't have enough information. So the first step to solving that is to have enough information, right? You will never have enough. You will just have sufficient information. So what do you read? And again, there is no right tactic to this, but as people who want to go into public speaking, as people who want to be aware, I'm just sharing with you certain things that I do myself, right? Reading news is one thing, understanding news is another, right? Especially given the kind of media we have these days, which is why I think it's always best to read different papers across the spectrum. So among the Indian papers, and I'll only speak about the English dailies because vernaculars are different and vernacular preferences are different. Among the English dailies, like the one newspaper I would really recommend reading among the Indian papers is the Hindu, right? The Hindu is by far the best in terms of its editorials, in terms of its relatively neutral understanding of situations. In Kolkata, the Telegraph editorials are not bad. Time to time, they are okay, they are good, right? Statesman used to be good, but then its standards have fallen, right? If you're looking at the journals in the West, also the online media is excellent in India. Places like The Quint, places like The Wired, The Scroll, they might have the occasional article that doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's because they allow other perspectives on their platform, and that's very important. Online magazine-wise, the Caravan magazine is brilliant. The Indian Express is there, of course. In terms of the West, things like The Economist. So The Economist has on their website, you don't even need to subscribe to this. When you go to The Economist website, there is a section called Debates. Over there, they have debate motions, and it's almost like a written debate. Like there is a case proposition, there is a case opposition, there is a moderator moderating, there are audience opinions. It's a wholesome debate, it's a wholesome experience. Do check those out. They have it like every 2 months. They ask you to vote as well. There are very interesting debates about data protection, about things like cross-border terrorism, about open borders, about nature of economies, even about whether pornography is healthy, right? So they don't have any like qualms over there. So very interesting debates, very interesting concepts. The Economist as a magazine is also excellent in terms of its editorials. Then there is obviously the BBC. Something very interesting happened. And this is where I'll just try to tell you a small story, right? Our identities are so much based on mutual perceptions to the extent where we often forget who we are individually, right? So it's very important to treat every person with a certain sense of skepticism in terms of the identities we label them. And as debaters and as public speakers, it's very important to do so also. I'll give you a very simple example. I was at this seminar where a former BBC journalist was speaking. And he said, so the whole, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, how many of you are aware of it, but Britain, like England and Ireland have always had very hostile relations, at least till the last part of the last century, right? And when there was cross-border terrorism from the Irish, at that time British media or English media specifically became very hostile, became very partisan, where they were criticizing the Irish. The BBC, as the benchmark of English journalism, did something very interesting. While they were reporting the incidents about Irish terrorist activities, they never for once used the word terrorist. Never for once did they use the word terrorist. Because as they say, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? So they believed that using the word terrorist was conditioning their readers into buying into a certain narrative of Ireland. That doesn't mean they were supporting the Irish cause. They were talking about why this is bad, why this sort of activity is bad, but they never used the word terrorist. So whenever at a debate you are calling somebody something or you're trying to ascribe a label to their beliefs, always be a little skeptical and always be aware and conscious of what that label can entail, right? So I thought I'll share that story. Okay. So moving on to the publications and what you all can read. So obviously The Economist is there. Then you have BBC. You have the Washington Post. You have the Guardian. The Guardian is very very impressive in terms of its editorials as well. I'm not saying read all of them. Right? I mean, what I do is I consume my news from certain sections. Like news in forms of capsules is also very useful. Like something like InShots. InShots also has its very insidious biases, but more or less it gives you an update of what is happening. Most of it is factual, objective reporting in a small paragraph. And there is only so much propaganda that you can pinch into a small paragraph also. So at the end of the day, when you want to have news, maybe something like an InShots, or there are several other apps, I'm sure, some maybe even I'm not aware of, which you can use. So have that source which gives you basic information. Then for the opinion pieces, maybe read one good national daily, couple of good foreign dailies. Don't read everything in a single day, just go through. Also, something that you can check out is so this website called The Wire. Every Sunday it brings out a collage or a collection of the best editorials from that week across all the English dailies based in India. Even if you don't get the time to go through all the Indian dailies, if you just read that Sunday column, which is a collection of all the articles, and it's free, you just can go online and check it out. I think it's great. It really opens your mind up. Because the moment you stop taking in information, you start becoming, hostile to certain sensitivities. You start becoming partisan. You won't even realize it, right? Suddenly, if somebody, badgered you with the same information every day and you don't get access to new information, you end up enhancing your prejudice. Goebbels, I don't know how many of you have heard of Goebbels. He was essentially the propaganda minister in Nazi Germany. And he had this famous line where he said, if you repeat a lie well enough for long enough, it becomes the truth, right? And that is very true. That is what a lot of people are doing in our own country today, right? So, if you start saying that Gaumutra can get rid of cancer, and if you don't have science which can counter that, there will be people who actually start believing that can happen, right? But then none of us is a Pragya Thakur, so we won't believe that for now. So anyway, I think that's it. In terms of other readings, it also helps in order to develop your language. What I like to do, for example, is I like to learn a couple of new words every day. And it helps, Sometimes these words are foreign language words which I may never use in a debate speech. Like the other day I came across this word called saudade. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Saudade is a Portuguese term. Okay, it's a term that describes a feeling of longing, nostalgia and despair. All three of them together. There is no English word which actually rests with saudade. There's only a Portuguese word that's been incorporated into English that actually translates this emotion. So finding out new words always helps, because having a good vocabulary makes you feel confident. The moment you don't have an argument, you can always couch it with a certain level of rhetoric, right? So that's it. And at the end of the day, guys, for those of you who will take up debating in college or have already done so and want to continue, just have fun. Enjoy the activity. That's the most important thing, right? Don't look at it as a burden. There are enough burdens in our lives already. Debating should be an outlet where you can express yourself. And expression is essential in today's world, because without it, you just end up being another robot produced by the capitalist war. So thank you for having me here.